Hi, I'm Beth Keene, CEO of Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust. Thank you for joining us for tonight's discussion on Life is Beautiful, the last film in this year's Teicholz Holocaust Remembrance film series that focused on Italy and the Holocaust. I wanted to thank Tom for bringing the idea of the film series to the museum 5 years ago, I think. So thank you for that and for your ongoing commitment and for doing such a great job curating this program for us. I'd like to also thank the Italian Consulate and the Italian Cultural Institute of Los Angeles for your partnership and for helping us to promote this series. I also want to thank the generous donors who have supported this film series and made it possible over the years. The Davidson Hooker Fund, Y&S Nazarian Family Foundation, Rita and Leo Greenland Family Foundation, and the Richenthal Foundation. Our museum brings you programs like today's free of charge, and we hope you've been enjoying them. So hopefully you'll consider making a donation by going to our website, lamoth.org. Now I'm thrilled to introduce our panelists for this evening. Joining us tonight, we have Andrea Malaguti and Jordanna Gessler. Dr. Andrea Malaguti, who is joining us from Amherst, Massachusetts, is Associate Professor of Italian and Film Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. His current research focuses on film image and social history, and his most recent book examines the cinematic images of women as social icons in Michelangelo Antonioni's earliest feature films of the 1950s. Jordanna Gessler is Vice President of Education and Exhibits at Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust. She has curated traveling museum exhibitions, developed several core education programs, and presented at conferences internationally. Jordana has a master's in Holocaust Studies from the University of Haifa. Moderating the discussion this evening will be Tom Teicholz. Tom is an award-winning journalist and best-selling author who writes about culture for Forbes.com. Thank you, Tom, for making this film series possible and for serving as today's moderator. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. Welcome all of you. It's really amazing. We few months ago did not know whether we would be able to even have the film series this summer. This is our 4th year, and it turned out that necessity being the mother of invention, we went virtual with a little bit of a shorter program, but doing so has been incredible because it's allowed people all over the country, in fact, all over the world, to watch these programs, hear our panels, and send in questions. We've had more than 600 people participate in these 3 weeks. Our first movie, The Garden of the Finzi Contini, which has not been available in streaming. We were lucky to have Arthur Cohn allow us to screen it. The second film, the documentary Syndrome K, is not available for streaming yet. And so we were really lucky that Neil Friedman and Menemsha Films were kind enough to let us screen it. And we've had amazing guests. And tonight, the last film in this summer series is Life is Beautiful, which was an Oscar-winning film for Best Foreign Film and Best Actor for Roberto Benigni. And we are really fortunate to have both Jordanna Gessler from the museum, who is someone who is passionate about this movie. In fact, I would say that she's the reason why we're showing it tonight. She's the one who suggested it when I said the Holocaust in Italy. The film is interesting for discussion because it is perceived and has engendered various different reactions, positive and negative, in Italy versus the US and in the US among film critics. And that's why we're so fortunate to have Professor Malaguti to give us some of the deeper context. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin first by having our professore tell us a little bit about the background and context in which to consider this movie. And then Jordana is going to make some opening remarks about why she thinks this movie is so important. And then we'll get into a discussion. I will remind you, all of you watching, that you can send in questions through the Q&A function, and we will try as best we can to answer them, technology dependent and all that. So, sono tutti qui, professore, andiamo.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you, Tom. And by the way, I'm just Andrea, professore. But thank you though. Thank you anyway. Just a few remarks about Roberto Benigni as an actor, Roberto Benigni as a screen icon, who throughout 1999, the year of Life is Beautiful, is already way into his career that started with on screen in 1977. Now, he always displays in all his movies a totally different behavior from what is socially accepted. And this behavior is always spontaneous and candid. The consequences of it, on the one hand, the comic effect, certainly, and on the other hand, exposing society's hypocrisies. And that is actually very important in his films in his 1970s, because he actually exposes the post-World War II bourgeois Italy that have been recanting its popular culture. Benigni brings it up again. Two films that I think are very important to mention, and one is actually American, in order to understand Life is Beautiful better, are the first one, 1986, Down by Law by Jim Jarmusch. Roberto Benigni ends up in prison and escapes with his prison companions Jack and Zach. His language might be impaired, though he actually insists in speaking English, gives this kind of extreme monologues, but he has more survival skills. He is the one who can actually get out of there, not just alive, but wedded to another Italian who happens to own a house right in the middle of the swamps, for better or for worse. The second film is Federico Fellini's The Voice of the Moon of 1990, which I think is a fundamental contact between Benigni and Fellini. How so? The film is about two factory workers that are able to take down the moon on Earth and basically anchor it on Earth. Benigni plays the part of a poet Ivo Salvini, that actually contemplates reality, quotes from Leopardi extensively, and visits a graveyard where other people are living. Are they living or are they dead? We actually don't know, and that's why the borderline between reality and imagination is always crossed. And that's one of Fellini's contributions. The second Fellini contribution, I think, is the display of fascism as a grotesque theater. And that's why it's completely spoofed. It's basically, fascism is this kind of grotesque and inflated rhetoric. And that's something that you see in Amarcord, Fellini's masterpiece of 1973. Benigni is in Life is Beautiful, he is the one who continually deflates that rhetoric all the time, in the first part and also in the second part, I would argue. And that is why I think it's odd for anyone, it's hard for me to understand whether Guido Orefice, that is Benigni's character, is aware or unaware of the mounting Semitism. I personally say he's aware, but it's my own personal view. And as far as anti-Semitism, a couple of words about the Shoah in Italian culture. As you probably know, everybody knows about Primo Levi and about his memorial that has been published in the United States with the title Survival in Auschwitz. Let's not forget that the true title is Se questo è un uomo, if this is a man. And the main tenet of that memoir is about preserving one's own humanity in Auschwitz, not exactly surviving, but preserving one's own humanity. He was very present in Italian culture all the way until all the way into the 80s as well. His last novel, If Not Now, When, Se Non Ora Quando, is from 1982 and goes back to that theme. The Jewish communities in Italy were very well integrated within the social system and within the political system as well. And in the early 1930s, actually Italy was considered some kind of safe haven from the persecutions that had already started in Lithuania in 1933, and I could talk about it later. But what I wanted to say is that basically the Jewish community was bourgeois in Italy. That's why the idea of the Jewish Schlemiel, that is the bungler that could turn that could turn into a resourceful and at times cunning manipulator of language and reality, this kind of odd man in, doesn't come from Italian Judaism, but from Central Europe via American culture. And I think that in this case, the fundamental contribution was by a scholar that some of you might know, because he was the director of the Istituto Italiano di Cultura, the Italian Institute of Culture of Los Angeles, between 1999 and 2004, Guido Fink, who basically diffused in Italy Harold Bloom's idea of Judaism and Midrash as literature. And that's why what we have, and he was Benigni's consultant precisely for La Vita è Bella. Therefore, Judaism also is critical method as this cult for language and commentary. So in this case, that is why I would say that in Benigni here we have two major aspects. On the one hand, the resourcefulness of the Schlemiel tempered with the contemplation of the poet. Apparently a bungler, but actually someone who sees beyond. And on the other hand, I would say the agile body of Charlie Chaplin. Not much in The Great Dictator, but even more in modern times, as we had the occasion to discuss, and I would like Tom to go more into it. And I would rather stop here and leave the word to Jordana. Thank you a lot.
Thank you. Jordana?
Of course. So, I mean, as we all know, various artworks from a broad spectrum of disciplines have directly and indirectly employed the Holocaust as a thematic backdrop. These diverse works appeared as early as during the Holocaust to as late as the current art world. And I do believe that Life is Beautiful does not fall into its typical cinematic genre that deals with the Holocaust topic, but is still very important to understanding different important themes throughout Holocaust history. As was briefly mentioned, Life is Beautiful received a great deal of criticism. The light, humoristic, non-realistic tones of the main character, despite being imprisoned in a concentration camp, critics often said that the Holocaust should allow for no artistic license. Depiction of the Holocaust must obey the rules of tragic realism. However, I do not believe this is wholly accurate. Life is Beautiful never pretends to emulate the realistic horrors of the Holocaust, but chooses to portray a meaningful, deep message that touches upon the human psyche by delivering a strong relationship between victims of the Holocaust. The sentimentalism inherent in this film is that of a father with his innocent child in a death camp. And in the right context, this is a powerful education tool that helps us, the viewer, interpret related themes in a much more metaphoric way. Thus, by understanding that no true work can ever truly depict the atrocities of the Holocaust, we can analyze the interpersonal relationships in Life is Beautiful without offending the memory of the Holocaust. One of my personal favorite parts of this film is that the first half of the film feels to have nothing to do with the Holocaust. Many Holocaust museums, films, books begin with the rise of Nazism. And at our museum in Los Angeles, and in this film, it is simply not the case. We show that Jews were people. They were human. There was a rich culture. There was a vibrant culture. They fell in love. They worked hard. They dealt with changing political spheres, new fascist governments. They made jokes. They had families. There was such a beautiful life before the Holocaust. And at our museum, it's so important for us, and I think in this film as well, that to understand what was lost, because without understanding what was lost, or in order to understand what was lost, we have to understand what was there first. And Life is Beautiful allows us to learn what existed before the Holocaust, what Jewish culture looked like in Italy, in Europe, in the world. And that way we can deeply commemorate what was lost during the war. Other important themes explored in this film that deserve to be explored further include paying homage to those lost, the resiliency despite numbering prisoners, the power of togetherness, moral aid, physical assistance, coping through bonded pairs in the camp, and most of all, strength, courage, and humanity. Learning from this film requires significant historical context. I would never recommend it as an intro to the Holocaust, but I think it can lead to such an important conversation about the capacity of human beings during the darkest time.
Thank you, Jordana. Well said. So, as we brought out, this is a 2-hour movie, the first hour of which there is almost no nothing related to the Holocaust, and only moments where we discover that Guido is Jewish and that he and his uncle are the victims of anti-Semitism. And the abruptness with which Guido and his son, and then eventually the wife, are taken away is quite dramatic. And I think, and I'm interested in both of your opinions. I felt that, there were certain details that signaled to us a reference to Auschwitz, the entrance to the camp, having a number tattooed on the arm. So clearly, these are specific references that we understand as Auschwitz. And obviously, from Primo Levi, we also know that so many Italian Jews ended up at Auschwitz. There were, of course, other Italian concentration and even extermination camps, like the Riserva de San Saba in Trieste, where many of the Nazis and their auxiliaries who worked at Treblinka and the other camps ended up at a later part in the war. So I think the tension between, is this a fable and a fantasy, and is this real? There's a little friction when we have those specific references to Auschwitz. What do you think, Andrea?
There is clearly, there is always that fine line between fantasy and reality. On the one hand, the entrance of the locomotive straight into Auschwitz, it is certainly very well staged. It reminds both of Auschwitz and of Europa. On the other hand, there comes the number tattooed on the arm. So I would say we are actually asked, what do you believe? How can we represent Auschwitz after it has been represented so many times so that it can be believed? Inasmuch as, is it the true Auschwitz? Impossible. But it's an Auschwitz that can be believed. I would say that we have to accept the two sides, both the reproduction and the sense that that is a reproduction, and the clue that brings us to reality and to the horrible reality that Auschwitz was. They're always one and the other at the same time. I think that that is one of the most important ciphers of Life is Beautiful. There's also a little episode, I think that signs the overlapping of these two and the conflict in between these two. Old Mr. Refice, played by Giustino Durano, one of the most important actors in the history of Italian post-war theater, is in the gas room and is actually undressing himself. They're supposed to take the showers, and we all know about Zyklon B, we as audience. A woman soldier goes around and trips into one of the clothes that was on the ground and falls. And he goes there and says, "Se fatta male, signora? Did you get hurt?" And she looks at him with this sense, "No, you are the one who's going to die, not me." So in that sense, the social comedy that is still somewhat preserved, and that on which the old uncle hangs on, and then the reality that comes. I would say that the two, that both the fable and the reality are always supposed to be together. You cannot detach one from the other.
Jordana?
Yeah, I agree with you that it's clearly referencing Auschwitz with the tattooing. But what I think is so important about this scene is the whole process of giving a person a number instead of a name and tattooing that number on an arm is a dehumanization process. And what this film does so well is showing the way in which people could cling to their humanity. So we have Guido who comes in and makes it a joke saying, they said that your son and you are not on the list. And I told them what? I almost fell over. He has this whole bit to keep his son's humanity and spirit alive. And even if you read Night by Elie Wiesel, right after the scene where they're tattooed at Auschwitz, a man asks, "Who is Wiesel from Siget?" And Ellie's father says, "That is me," showing that his father would not give in to the number instead of the name. And so the fact that this is historic and it's factual, that people truly did maintain their human dignity by identifying by their name, I think this movie does by bringing some sort of light and joy and showing the way in which Guido maintains his humanity despite receiving this tattoo. So I actually think it's one of the most pivotal moments in the film, because you're starting to see him create this game and create a space in which his son can survive both physically, emotionally, and mentally.
And I want to return to that in a second, but first I do want to bring up with Andrea, in the first hour of the movie, there are some of these quite obvious borrowings from Chaplin. There is the scene borrowed from Modern Times. In Modern Times, Chaplin picks up a flag on the street and suddenly finds himself leading a parade of communists. In Life is Beautiful, they're driving in the car and they crash through and they end up people thinking that they're the ones leading the parade of the fascists into this village with the king. Similarly, in the same way that Chaplin in The Great Dictator made fun of the Nazi goose-stepping and salutes, Guido, of course, makes fun of the fascists putting their arms straight out and their salutes.
Yes.
Those are very clear references. Is that something that Italians could, by this time, laugh at, or was it funny or not funny for an Italian audience?
Well, personally, I think it was. It was already, let us say, a stereotype behavior, but once a stereotype behavior that had been heavily revisited and heavily recognized as an excessive rigidity who could be either comic or fatal. The whole gamut of Italian films revisiting fascism of the 1970s basically represent precisely that kind of rigidity either as mortal, either as violence, or as a big grotesque spoofery on their court. So yes, it was, and we all, but on the other hand, let me just say this. Benigni has the advantage of being very minute, so not absolutely credible as a fascist. He will always be the odd man in, if not just for his physique.
Right.
So, and
Like
he knows,
Chaplin.
like Chaplin, and he knows that, and he knows that he has that in common with Chaplin, being the odd man in, and he studied Chaplin very closely in order to also to move his body, also his gait at times, which I think is quite different in that film from others that I've seen. So there you basically find in this movie really the odd man in, within the context that Jordana talked about.
Mm-hmm. I was struck, again, having watched Finzi Contini's 2 weeks ago, and Syndrome K last week, that in a sense, Benigni's attempt to be a person whose imagination, whose life in a fantasy, where he calls the woman he loves Principessa, and creates miracles for her to happen, and all this, to me, that is a metaphor for how Italy's Jews in particular, and Italian society in general, lived in a fantasy world, not realizing the true dangers of anti-Semitism and fascism. And even when he gets to the camp, Guido's wanting to protect his son and create this fantasy game works up until the point where Guido sees the pile of bodies in that sort of almost dream-like fog. And then it's no longer a dream. And shortly after that, Guido is murdered, which to me, again, could be saying you can only take that fantasy so far. The reality fell hard and tragically upon the Jews of Italy. So that was my reaction, seeing it now in the context of the other movies and the Italian history we've learned in the last few weeks. Jordana, do you want to react to that?
I think that it's almost too simplistic to talk about Italian Jews or Italians appearing as if anti-Semitism didn't exist, or if the Nazis couldn't come to their doorsteps, because I don't think they're unique in that. I agree that it is a metaphor for Jews in many communities outside of Italy, including Italy. I don't think it's specific to Italian communities. I mean, the same could be said for Hungary, even talking about those who lived in Vichy France, where almost if you were gonna, and I love the way that you look at it, but it's really, I think, the way in which most people were preparing for a Nazi invasion, which is not at all. And I agree that that metaphor is important, but understanding, I think, Guido's death is the fact in which he lived to ensure that his son would survive. And at the end, that is exactly what he did.
Right.
And I think he understood, and us as a viewer most of the time understood, what was in danger if, he dropped the game or wasn't able to hide his son. But I do think that the important moment in that is understanding that not everyone, so when you look at, Holocaust survivors, those who had incredible resiliency during the camps were those who were able to have a coping pair. It's been demonstrated in numerous psychological studies that people who were able to bond with another person, whether they were blood related or not, were most likely to exhibit resiliency during and after the Holocaust. However, not everyone always survived from those pairs. And I think that's the important part that we understand, that, just because Guido doesn't live doesn't mean that his voice doesn't live. And if you remember, the film is told from the perspective of his son. The introduction and the conclusion are both his son sharing his father's story and honoring it. So I think it reminds us to honor those who perished as survivors, as descendants, as survivors, as communities. And I think those are some really important metaphors to pick up on.
Yes, and he does call it his gift. His father's gift is what
exactly.
Andrea?
Well, I don't know whether I am in total agreement of the idea of this, of Guido's games, Guido's language games, Guido's reconstructions of reality as the fiction that does not look at the reality of anti-Semitism. But certainly I would say there is this idea of the times of the, how can I say, the fiction of comedy, the fiction of social comedy, of social acceptability, of keeping up. For instance, all the sequences of the hotel, all the scenes of the hotel remind me clearly of Ernest Lubitsch.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And this
when he's a waiter.
Yeah. His behavior as a waiter seems to come out of Hollywood in the 1940s, exactly when Lubitsch was active. So this kind of social comedy, where does the shadow of Auschwitz trickle in? It trickles in when the bourgeois at the table start counting the casualties of Germany as when they start talking about the kids that learn mathematics, thinking about how much the state saves on so many disabled people dying.
Right.
When that abstraction appears, that's when the shadow of Auschwitz is actually coming closer.
Well, and there's also the very troubling scene where Guido believes that this German who he was so friendly with, who could solving his puzzles, was going to in fact save him and his son. And it turns out that all the German cares about is the puzzles. He doesn't even see the danger that Guido's in or acknowledge it, really.
Even if hard to say that well, I totally agree. I don't know whether Guido wants to be saved. At least he wants to be seen, as if he wants to be seen as a man who suffers in that condition with that uniform on. When he says, "C'è anche mia moglie," there's my wife here as well. As if he is bringing up a humanity that before was not the case, as if that social comedy in Guido's thought could have brought something else, some kind of closer humanity. No, it's just the absurd calculation, which is precisely the same of the people of the schoolmaster who was actually, of the schoolmistress who was actually calculating the death. Yes.
One of the questions that we've received from our audience asked that we address the question of the Holocaust and films that have a humorous aspect, such as Jojo Rabbit, which is a recent film, or the German original film version of Jacob the Liar. let's forget the American Robin Williams version, which was not successful. But Jordana, do you want to talk about Jojo Rabbit?
Yeah, so I actually think that Life is Beautiful falls into the same category as Jojo Rabbit, and maybe even to like a certain extent, Inglourious Bastards. But these are films that are not intended to teach us about the Holocaust. But I think that on surface level, they seem to be hilarious. But if you scratch that surface, there's this darker reality under it that is so important to understand. And I think, for example, with Jojo Rabbit, the amount of historical accuracy and understanding the way that the Hitler Youth worked and functioned, both before the end of the war and even during the end of the war with the siege on Berlin, to be able to have that conversation and look past the humor and understand that this was the truth and it's ridiculous because it is ridiculous. This level of propaganda, this level of stereotypes, this level of hate is absurd. And so you need to almost force people to kind of laugh for them to then sit back and say, this is not what the world should be and this is not what humanity should be. So exactly the example that you gave earlier with the German and his word games. For us to sit back and say, this is ridiculous, like this could never have happened. There are so many non-Jewish people during the Holocaust who turned on their Jewish friends or who chose to ignore the fact that their lives are in jeopardy and danger. And so I think that when these films are created, and I can't speak for the people who create them, but the humor is meant to catch your attention. And then once you watch it as an intelligent and analytical person, you can say, this message about humanity is so much deeper and so much more serious than this. And in a way, I think it brings the reality to screen in a way that, you know, Schindler's List couldn't do, because Schindler's List is forced to be historically accurate, so can't touch on all of these nuanced, specific, unique themes during the Holocaust. And I think in that way, it actually does teach us something about human beings, about history. It makes us feel a little bit uncomfortable. And when you lean into that discomfort, there's so much that you can learn.
Someone wrote in that they don't understand or don't see the point in comedy in a telling of the Holocaust experience, because they were personally for 6 years in camps and there was nothing funny about it. And I think, you know, obviously we have to respect that. I think all of us know many Holocaust survivors who had very dark and funny senses of humor. Certainly my parents did. I can't say that they had them during those years, but they certainly had them afterwards. And they certainly brought that to any account they gave. I do think it's interesting that we try and negotiate these things in a way to make them new and fresh to a new audience. And that's also part of the challenge. Andrea?
Well, for one thing, as you said before, I respect everybody's feelings. Everybody is entitled to their own feelings. When they say that they don't see the point, I'll have to say there's so many things of which I don't see the point myself in the world, in my experience. I don't know if I can explain everything. What I can say is that we always try to retell these stories. Every time in history, every possible experience tries to retell the story. There's this film that I'm so fond of, which is To Be or Not to Be by Ernest Lubitsch, 1942, when one of the actors of that company gives out Shylock's soliloquy. And that is a major reference to something that in 1942 in Europe was still happening.
Yes.
So Roberto Benigni, with all his experience from the popular theater of the 1970s, when they tried to revamp popular culture and oppose the hypocrisy of Italian bourgeois culture and this kind of recanting of poverty that was during the economic boom, then at the end of the 1990s, tried to retell this kind of story. Nowadays, with these other icons like Scarlett Johansson, we have what's the name of that film?
Jojo.
Jojo Rabbit.
Jojo Rabbit. Sorry, my memory is a colander. We always try to narrative is a continual renegotiation through history.
And I also think that you know, we are more willing to let an artwork occur, for example, not on film, that, for example, anyone who has seen Mouse by Art Spiegelman, right? Well, it's a comic book where the Jews, you know, are mice and the Nazis are cats, and on its face, there could be nothing more, you know, that would be sacrilegious or inappropriate or whatever, and yet everyone recognizes Mouse as a great work of art that does break through to us. And I think we're I think it's because comic books and graphic arts are already a realm where we accept certain superheroes, transformative transformations. We're not necessarily as generous as we might be with films, in part because on film we see documentaries and we see the truth of events, and we're looking for a truth that sometimes is difficult to arrive at in what Benigni himself called a fable. He called life is beautiful. The first words on the screen are, "This is a fable."
Yeah, and actually, I'm so glad you brought up Mouse, because I think the funniest part of that comic book is that the French people are frogs. But I do think that that's what allows us to access such a traumatic history. And Tom, it really resonated with me when you spoke about your parents, because my grandfather, who was a Holocaust survivor, if we ever did something to annoy him, he would look at us and be like, "Are you a Nazi?" And he would say it as a joke. And that was completely normal to me growing up. And then when I became an adult, I realized that's not something you should say to people. But there is a way in which we use humor to deal with something that's so difficult to touch. It's so unimaginable. We can never even picture what that experience is. And there's something about humor that makes it feel like safe to approach it and then to dive deep into it. And even I would say Life is Beautiful in some ways isn't even a comedy. I think Guido as a human being is a comedian. Like, his characters, full of jokes, full of laughter, full of imagination, you know, riding in on a white horse, sweeping his princess away. And I think the important aspect is he never loses that during his time in the concentration camp. So whether as a person you are somebody who's very serious or very funny, to maintain your identity, your humanity during such a dehumanizing time, I think that's like the pure example of resiliency. And the fact that he was able to do that saves his son's life. So in a way, it's not a comedy movie. It's just a movie about somebody who happens to be a comedian.
I think that's beautifully said. And Andrea, if you have another comment, please. Otherwise, I think this is a good place to end our conversation. I'll give you the last word.
I approve totally of what Jordana said. I couldn't say it better. Thank you a lot.
Well, so on that beautiful note, and with our discussion of life is beautiful, I want to thank all of you for participating in this 4th year of the Teicholz Holocaust Remembrance film series, hosted by the Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust. Please, if you feel so moved to donate whatever you feel like donating to the film series or to the museum, I encourage you to do so. And we look forward to seeing you again next year, next summer, when we host this film series again. Again, thank you, Professore. Thank you, Jordana. To everyone, we say ciao.
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 Ci vediamo.
A presto.
A presto.